What's the scariest conspiracy theory you believe is 100% true? Chapter 1. Jeffrey Epstein.
That arresting the people in Jeffrey Epstein's little black book would bring this world to a grinding halt because of how many disgusting rich people there are in power.
Meanwhile, my conspiracy is that Epstein is the best thing that ever happened to all the many other disgusting billionaires and near billionaires who do exactly the same thing and now get to fly under the radar because everyone is so fixated on Epstein. To be clear, most ultra-wealth people just engage in the most boring forms of exploitation, e.g. labor exploitation, legal forms of market, tax manipulation, etc. But there are loads other well-connected predators whose behavior is pretty much common knowledge, like Epstein's was, who have been cut a whole lot of slack when all the focus shifted to Epstein and Maxwell as though they were somehow unique. Just ask anyone who's modeled as a young teen, at the high fashion level, and they'll be able to rhyme off a dozen names without blinking.
One thing among the many things I do not understand about Epstein and his group is this: okay, you're a wealthy, powerful person with a taste for young women. Why risk all the serious legal, logistical, etc. trouble of trafficking them into a jurisdiction where sex with women that age is potentially illegal when there are plenty of places around the world where age of consent is relatively low and the most you're going to catch is a minor prostitution charge if you get caught? It makes no sense to me. Unlimited money, tons of power, and potentially a lot to lose if caught. Why not just travel someplace first class and go to town, so to speak, where you know you are within the law or at least just breaking relatively small time laws?
I think you overestimate the importance of these rich fricks. If the 0.001% all got off at once, everything would still go on just fine. Lots of empty seats on boards of big companies though. Oh noes. It's the apocalypse. Kill every 10th senior engineer though. Now we have a problem.
This isn't really a conspiracy though. Just truth. But I think the darker implications about Epstein's influence aren't being spoken about enough. He was flying in scientists, doctors, politicians, big pharma reps, gaining information and potential blackmail material on all of them. Getting them to push new drugs that enter the US and UK markets, paid for by the people in the US and UK government, that they know is in fact harmful or ineffective, raking in billions whilst also increasing the value of any investments in those companies.
That is not a conspiracy, that is a sad reality. And is not just there, it happened here as well. Sadly, absolute power absolutely corrupts, and is not like humans are on average that good to begin with. So, when you give them the chance to get away with it? Oh boy, just for the record, in my country there was a model that denounced a pedophilia network among the showbiz. She, Natasha Jayat, even said she was going to get murdered and surprise surprise she overdosed. In fact, her cell phone was activated once a posteriori, so there was suspected manipulation. Nothing came out of it a fake.
I heard an opinion on the Danny Jones podcast that Epstein was Mossad. Eric Weinstein thinks it, too. It makes sense. Ghislaine Maxwell's dad was Mossad, his fortune is missing, and Epstein went from high school teacher to uber-wealthy investment type with no record of investing to getting compromat on everyone he could schmooze. Weinstein called him a construct.
Chapter 2, Coke Classic.
In the early 1980s, Coca-Cola deliberately removed Coke Classic, made with cane sugar, from production and introduced New Coke, aka Coke 2, as a ruse, knowing full well that people would complain that it wasn't the same as before. So they staged an apology commercial from Coke's CEO saying, "We're sorry. We hear you." When has a CEO ever said that? Lol. And reintroduced Coke Classic, with corn syrup instead of cane sugar. Knowing that by the time it was re-released, the market's inventory of the original Coke Classic had largely been distributed and consumed, so very few people, if any, could actually compare them side by side to see if they tasted the same. By the way, the tariffs on cane sugar were increased ginormously just before they did this, which was a way to encourage domestic corn production. TLDR, Coke pulled a switcheroo by changing sweeteners and lied saying that it was the exact same as before.
This is why you buy Mexican Cokes. In a glass bottle, with sugar as God intended.
It's called Mexican Coca-Cola today and sold in glass bottles. Maybe the sugar costs are lower in Mexico? I'm not sure, but it's the only one we will buy. It tastes better. Sold at all the usual supermarkets on the soda aisle.
Chapter 3, Samsung Glucose Meter. Samsung announced that the Galaxy Watch 4 would include a non-invasive continuous glucose monitor, which would allow you to monitor your blood sugar at any time while you wear it, for as long as you own it. A month before the 4 was released, that feature quietly disappeared from all of the marketing, without explanation, and now, years later, is nowhere to be found. I believe Abbott Laboratories, makers of the Freestyle Light Glucometer and the Freestyle Libre continuous glucose monitor systems, panicked, fearing that a non-expiring, non-invasive glucose monitor would be hugely popular among diabetics, and devastate their death grip on the market, paid a huge bribe to Samsung to drop the whole thing.
More likely they couldn't get either the accuracy or longevity to meet the stringent requirements of an actual medical device, and the legal team realized that when people started slipping into diabetic comas or having horrendously uncontrolled glucose levels while their watch told them they were fine, it was going to be an absolute clusterfuck. Bad data is worse than no data.
It's not that nefarious likely. Something that tells you your blood glucose and is verifiable and repeatable? That's a medical device. Something that tells you your blood glucose but the company says, it's for info and entertainment? That's a lawsuit waiting to happen. The difference in the tech isn't the hardware, it's all the validation that goes behind it.
Type 1 diabetic here. This is just completely false. No one has been able to design a non-invasive blood glucose meter that actually works, much less miniaturize that technology to fit inside a smartwatch. I've heard rumors that Apple has a prototype right now that is a little larger than an iPhone. Shrinking all of that down to fit inside a small portion of a smartwatch is almost sci-fi level stuff at this point. There would be no reason to take any bribes if this technology was real because of how insanely popular it would be. You can safely abandon this conspiracy theory.
They certainly pay off generic companies not to bring competing generics to market. That said, a watch-based, non-invasive glucose meter is very complicated and the technology is currently not very accurate. They very well may have had FDA approval issues with its inclusion.
Meh. Apple Watch was supposed to have one of these too a couple years back. My Occam's razor explanation? Big Tech wanted to cash in on the biotech trend a few years ago, and some skunkworks team read some grad students' thesis on this tech and pitched it to execs. Buy from all the other techs got wind of it and the race began. But unlike social media apps and advertising, biomedical equipment is not so easy. Turns out science is harder than boosting clicks. In the end, none of them could make one that reliably works across the general population, and none of them want to open themselves up to litigation for providing misleading medical data. Not to mention that it conceivably make their watches a durable medical device which demands a ton of regulations. It was a money pit and they couldn't make one work well.
Chapter 4: Chaos by Elites.
Elites create chaos and divide us so they can go on their merry way of exploiting everything. They are stoking black versus white, right versus left, straight versus gay versus trans, etc., to distract us from them pulling the strings. We have to stop all this bullshit and get to the real problem, which is all driven by money. Particularly where money and politics align.
It's been going on for a long time. Racism in the U.S. became entrenched when the landowners pitted the poor whites against the slaves, free slaves, because, at least you're white. They knew that if the poor whites and the slaves, later freed slaves, got together, they could overthrow the landowners.
I don't even think this is a conspiracy per se, just an awful fact of life. I feel like it's gotten worse with social media since it's easier to stoke the flames of anger, but it's always been like this, at least in the US. Building off of this thought, it's so hard to get people to see it. I'll be having conversations with people about the current state of affairs and I'll posit that it's a class thing, not a race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, gun, etc. thing, and if I don't get blank looks or eye rolls, it gets pointed out that my view is Marxist, socialist, and socialism doesn't work, yada yada yada. FFs just because I believe that no one should have billions of dollars doesn't mean I want the state to run all of the businesses.
It's why poor countries are always in crisis.
It's extra nefarious because at the same time as stoking chaos, they are also defunding education and making secondary education as inaccessible as possible. So, a good portion of the country is literally too ignorant and uneducated to recognize what's happening. And the educated people who do realize what's going on also don't just want to ignore blatant homophobia, racism, and sexism. These things simply should have ceased to be major issues by now. But here we are, aware that the elites are pushing us to this fighting, but also We don't want to just roll over and allow them to criminalize abortion, kill black people, and eliminate gay and trans rights. It's freaking stupid.
Yes. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. There's some of us that clearly see what's going on, and then the other half is completely oblivious to it.
The irony is, that very talk is adopted by anti-establishment, right-wingers who follow Andrew Tate and Donald Trump and are susceptible to all the buzzwords: deep state, Pizzagate, QAnon. They talk about red pill, blue pill, the woke agenda, and seeing the world for how it really is. The irony is actually nuts. Because all I see is conservative propaganda from the top down, stoking a fire that the many lap up, and I simply don't understand why they can't see through it.
To pivot even further on this, that same elite class pays social media provocateurs to embed themselves in those groups and seeds them with false information to widen the gap between legitimate truths and wild baseless conspiracy. I've had to pull some good friends away from those honeypots.
Agree, and to add to the above, they also work together, media influence, to create news, distractions. I.e., don't want the pores to notice, react to an important situation? No problem. Just flood the news with some juicy, A-list celeb, gossip. The old razzle-dazzle, misdirection technique.
This is exactly why people freak out over things like pronoun selection in Starfield, but had no issue with Morrowind in 2002 having an openly non-binary character, who was a god. A movie like Mrs. Doubtfire could never be made nowadays. Movie theaters would literally be burnt down, all over something that hurts nobody.
Ironically, big business actually thrives on stability, and are very keen on diversity in the workforce to improve problem-solving and have more skilled people to choose from. We plebs, on the other hand, are very keen on Brexit and border walls. And the internet has given us a platform and means of filtering out anyone we disagree with.
Chapter 5. Low food quality.
Food quality is intentionally low to increase the need for medication and supplements. Adequate health care is unaffordable to keep the workers in the ACA gap from living long enough to benefit from the social security that they have contributed to for their whole working lives.
The food we have been eating in the United States is a huge part of the mental illness going on today.
I started eating cleaner. I am not perfect, but I notice such a tremendous change in my energy and overall being for the positive.
I think that the prevalence of multiple types of myopathies in most chicken available in the U.S. is responsible for or at least worsening various physical and mental health problems. Almost all of the chicken we eat is diseased, and I don't think we fully know what consequences that can have.
Food dyes like Red 40 can cause issues like ADHD, irritability, and depression. It's already banned in several other countries, but it's fine in the U.S. Another substance is potassium bromide, which is used to improve flour. It is also banned in a bunch of different countries, and California has proposed a ban for it too. It is linked to cancer in animal studies, and can negatively affect your kidneys and nervous system. It isn't necessary for bread, so it's not something you need to have.
They removed all of the healthy parts of flour in order to make it shelf-stable. This caused several noticeable increases in diseases that were linked to some of the missing nutrients. So now they remove everything good, 35 to 40 different nutrients, add back in manufactured replacements, 5 nutrients, and call it enriched flour. If you have the ability, I highly recommend milling your own flour. Bread should be good for you if we would just quit messing up our food.
I wish people were more concerned about this. The FDA does not exist to protect us anymore, it exists to protect our corrupted food industry. Our foods in the U.S. contain so many things that are proven to be harmful in other countries. It all started with industrialization and grew from there. Now there are seed oils in almost every processed or pre-made food here. Even baby formula contains seed oils. For people who are sensitive to such things, it's very dangerous and literally causes chronic illnesses. They're starting to call type 2 diabetes the processed foods diet, and this is part of it. I cut out all mass-produced seed oils, preservatives and food dyes considered dangerous to the rest of the world, and foods containing added sugars, and have reversed my IBS and GERD, which I have been struggling with my entire life. My rheumatoid arthritis has also chilled out, and I'm no longer experiencing flares of that.
I was on a really good trajectory before the pandemic with eating healthy, and over the last 3 years have had a much harder time. I've recently gotten more serious about it again. I was grocery shopping yesterday and paying attention to the sheer volume of food available that has little nutritional value and lots of harmful shit. It's really disheartening to look in the frozen vegetables section and see a huge bank of French fries, tater tots, etc. These things just don't have much to offer for our body's needs, and yet that's what we fill up on.
Chapter 6. Nuclear power is dangerous.
Nuclear power. Climate change can be solved in a way that doesn't impoverish everyone if we use nukes to make electricity. This solution was sitting there back in the 80s when we first started talking about global warming. It's almost 40 years later and we aren't building nuclear power plants.
Oil companies spend a lot of money slandering nuclear power plants and how dangerous they are, despite the fact there have only been 3 incidents, one of which was caused by a tsunami that we can't control, one caused by Soviet government incompetence, and if I'm not mistaken, 3 Mile Island was part mechanical, part human error. However, the US actually tried to solve the problem instead of cover it up.
And 3 Mile Island was much more of a PR disaster than a nuclear disaster. The media frenzy happened due to poor communication. Mistakes were made at the plant itself, but with better communication, it would have been understood to be basically a non-event.
I don't think it was the oil companies, I think it was green eco-warrior types. They are the ones still holding things up. But if the belief that we are fighting big oil helps us build nukes, I say whatever works.
The green eco-warriors are just the youthful who aren't experienced enough in life, nor energy markets, to know that they have been misled and are pawns that get used by multiple fronts: intel, government, oil, crypto scammers, corporate interests in farmlands, etc., to push an agenda that consolidates power elsewhere. If they had any clue who wrote their actual talking points, they would feel so disgusted and betrayed. They are toward the top of the list of pawns being used today by murky interests, even to the point of shutting off nuclear energy in Germany, where the only replacement is going to be coal.
Plenty of people in Japan still adamantly against nuclear power as well, tons of no signs to find all over the country. And so they keep using coal plants and spend summers refusing to turn on air cons until it reaches at least 28 to 30 C with 75% humidity indoors, set to the lowest fan speed, of course, and then wonder why a bunch of old people die of heat stroke. Oh, and nothing has any insulation at all, so all of that barely on aircon's minimal cooling effect just pisses out every window and crack. And then in winter it's time to break out the kerosene heaters.
Here's the real conspiracy here. Families on top of the economic ladder who are planning 500 to 1,000 years into the future created a regulatory mess with help of friends in the government and have been stockpiling uranium for that time when there are far fewer humans, and it means an endless stream of energy for those who get to live then. They actually want a collapse between humans using coal, oil, sometime to ride out nature coming back to take over, and them setting up their future civilizations. Maybe that all sounds a bit fanciful, and I'm being liberal here in painting the picture, but the regulatory mess around nuclear seems like purposeful sabotage. It's not just the bad you would expect around dangerous operations. It's over that side of the cliff and others, making it a very daunting project to add new nuclear. As well, uranium markets over the past few decades have been, well, let's just say interesting and telling. I think the propaganda being used to shut down nuclear plants in Germany today is highly unnatural, and likely was staged either by foreign intel or other interests who want them to continue with coal, oil. It's a very confusing rabbit hole to go down once you realize what a life-saving technology it is, and how it seemed to peak in the 80s before retreating. My dad was a nuclear engineer, and I was sure during my youth that we would be in a much better place than we are now with the electrical grid. It's all taught me to trust no one I haven't met face to face, and to scrutinize them even more. Needless to say, these people do not have our best interests in heart.